There is something unsettling about a person who stays calm when everything around them is not. Imagine a heated argument unfolding in a room. Voices rise, emotions spill over. People interrupt each other, defend themselves, try to dominate the space with volume and intensity. The atmosphere becomes unstable, almost predictable in its chaos, and then there is one person who does not react. No raised voice, no visible frustration, no emotional leakage at all. Just stillness, not awkward stillness. Not passive confusion, but controlled calmness, as if nothing in the environment has successfully reached them. And strangely, that is the moment people begin to feel uncomfortable. Not because anything aggressive is happening, but because something expected is missing. Why does calmness feel more threatening than anger? Anger is readable. It signals intention. It gives emotional information. It tells others where the person stands, how they feel, and what might happen next. Chaos in its own way is predictable because it is expressive, but calmness removes that entire system. Human beings are trained to read emotion as information. Every facial expression, every tone shift, every reaction is processed as a signal to understand intent. It is how we navigate social reality. It is how we predict behavior. But when someone remains calm, that signal disappears, and the mind does not like missing information, so it fills the gap. They are hiding something. They are thinking too much. They are dangerous because they are unreadable. Not because any of it is proven, but because uncertainty feels unsafe. This is where calmness stops being misunderstood and starts being misinterpreted as something deeper. Calmness removes predictability, and unpredictability triggers fear, because if you cannot predict someone's reaction, you cannot easily influence it. You cannot pressure it. You cannot fully control the social outcome around it. The calm person becomes a variable the room cannot solve, and that alone changes how others respond to them. Slowly, attention shifts. Not openly, but subtly. People begin watching them more than they listen to them. Their silence becomes louder than other people's speech. Their stillness starts feeling like judgment, even when no judgment is being expressed. But in reality, nothing has changed except perception, and that is the unsettling part. You may have already experienced this without realizing it. Maybe you stayed calm in a situation where others expected emotion. Maybe your silence was mistaken for arrogance. Maybe your lack of reaction created more tension than any argument ever could. Chaos is loud. Control is silent. The scariest person in the room is not the one expressing the most emotion, but the one who needs to express the least. Because calmness is not the absence of emotion, it is control over it. And once that realization enters the mind, it becomes difficult to look at silence the same way again. To understand why calmness feels unsettling, you first have to understand how human perception was designed to work. The human brain is not built for truth. It is built for prediction, for survival, for speed. Throughout evolution, reading emotional signals correctly often meant the difference between safety and danger. A sudden expression of anger could signal threat. Fear in another person could signal nearby danger. Excitement could signal opportunity or reward. Every emotion functioned like a shortcut, an immediate piece of information that helped the brain decide how to respond. Anger, threat, fear, vulnerability, excitement, engagement. This system worked because emotion was information. But calmness breaks that system completely. A calm face, a controlled voice, a steady presence provides very little emotional data for the brain to interpret. And when the brain cannot interpret something quickly, it does not remain neutral. It begins to search. This is where emotional signaling theory becomes important. Human beings are constantly broadcasting microsignals, intentions, moods, dominance, submission, uncertainty. We are always, even unconsciously, communicating something, but calm individuals reduce that signal output, and the brain experiences that reduction as ambiguity, which triggers uncertainty, anxiety. The mind hates unresolved patterns. It is constantly trying to complete them. When it cannot decode someone's emotional state, it does not accept unknown as an answer. It generates possibilities instead. They must be smarter than us. They are emotionally detached. They are calculating everything. Notice what is happening here. Calmness is no longer being perceived as neutral. It is being interpreted as something hidden, something deeper, something intentional. This is where the predictive brain model explains everything. The brain is a prediction machine. It tries to anticipate behavior before it happens, but prediction requires patterns, repetition, emotional consistency. Calm people disrupt that predictability because their internal state is not immediately visible externally. And when prediction fails, the brain compensates by assigning meaning, even if that meaning is incorrect. In modern society, this effect becomes even stronger. We live in an environment of overexpression. People constantly share emotions, reactions, opinions, identities. Everything is visible, readable, and immediate. Loudness has become normal, so when someone does not participate in that constant emotional broadcasting, they feel unnatural in comparison, almost out of place, almost intentional. The absence of reaction starts feeling like a reaction itself, and this is where perception shifts. Calmness is not just misunderstood anymore. It begins to be misinterpreted as control, as awareness, as hidden intelligence, because in a world where everyone is constantly revealing themselves, the person revealing the least becomes the hardest to categorize and the most psychologically intriguing. The mind fears what it cannot decode, and emotionless reactions begin to feel like hidden intentions. That is why calmness does not just disrupt communication, it disrupts interpretation itself. And once interpretation breaks down, power dynamics quietly begin to shift. Calmness becomes powerful the moment it turns into emotional control rather than emotional absence. There is a major difference between someone who feels nothing and someone who feels everything but chooses not to react. One is numb, the other is disciplined. Throughout history, thinkers and leaders who mastered emotional control were often the ones who influenced situations without appearing to dominate them. The philosophy of Stoicism, taught by figures like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, was built on one central idea. You cannot control external events, but you can control your response to them, and that response is where power begins. Calm individuals operate differently in high-pressure environments. While others react instantly, they pause. While others rush to defend themselves, they observe. While others become emotionally flooded, they step slightly outside the situation and assess it. This creates a psychological gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, control exists. A reactive person gives access to their emotional state immediately. They reveal frustration, insecurity, anger, excitement, fear, often without filtering it. That emotional transparency makes them easy to read. And what can be read can also be influenced, but a controlled individual does something very different. They delay reaction. They process before responding. They choose their emotional output instead of leaking it. This is why calm people often hold a quiet form of dominance in negotiation. The person who reacts first usually reveals more than they intend. The person who stays calm creates uncertainty in the other side, and uncertainty forces the other person to adjust their behavior. Psychological unpredictability becomes leverage because manipulation at its core relies on emotional reaction. Most influence techniques require a predictable response. Guilt triggers guilt, anger triggers anger. Pressure triggers panic, praise triggers compliance. But when someone does not react immediately, those patterns begin to fail. The system breaks. This is why calm individuals are often harder to manipulate. Not because they are immune to influence, but because they interrupt the emotional feedback loop that manipulation depends on. Compare the two. A reactive person is constantly being moved by external stimuli. Their emotions are visible, immediate, and therefore usable against them. They can be rushed, provoked, or emotionally guided without much resistance. A controlled person, however, creates distance between feeling and response. That distance makes their behavior harder to predict, and anything unpredictable becomes harder to control. Reaction is surrender. Control is power, but emotional control is not just about dominance over others. It is also about internal freedom. When you are not constantly reacting to every comment, every situation, every emotional trigger, you reclaim mental space. You begin to see situations more clearly instead of emotionally distorting them. And yet, there is a deeper layer here that most people ignore. What do you lose when you stop reacting emotionally to everything? Because emotional control does not only remove manipulation, it also removes impulsive connection. It changes how you experience relationships, conflict, and even identity itself, and that leads to an important truth. Calmness is not always strength. Sometimes it is not mastery at all. Sometimes it is something else entirely, shaped by experience rather than discipline. Not all calmness is strength. Sometimes what looks like emotional control on the surface is actually emotional exhaustion underneath it. There are people who are calm, not because they have mastered their emotions, but because they learned through experience that expressing them creates consequences. Betrayal teaches caution. Emotional neglect teaches silence. Repeated invalidation teaches invisibility. Fear of conflict teaches suppression. And over time, something subtle happens inside a person's psychology. They stop reacting not because they are in control, but because reacting no longer feels safe. At first, they try to express themselves normally. They speak honestly. They show emotion when they feel it. They trust that communication will be met with understanding. But when those moments are dismissed, misunderstood, punished, or ignored often enough, the brain begins to adapt, not emotionally first, but behaviorally. The person starts holding things in, not because they want to, but because expression no longer feels productive. Eventually, silence becomes the default response. Calmness becomes the mask that prevents further emotional damage. This is where psychological withdrawal begins to form. Emotional numbing replaces intensity. Dissociation replaces engagement. Hyper-awareness replaces spontaneity. The mind starts observing more than it participates. It begins scanning environments for emotional safety rather than emotional connection. Tone becomes more important than words. Body language becomes more important than explanations. The person becomes calm, but not because life feels stable, because unpredictability once felt dangerous. The loudest silence is born from unheard pain. This is where the dual Nature of calmness becomes important because from the outside, the result can look identical. A person who is emotionally controlled and a person who is emotionally withdrawn may both appear calm, quiet, and composed. But internally, their origins are completely different. One comes from mastery, the other comes from survival. One is built through awareness and discipline. The other is built through adaptation to emotional pain. And yet society rarely makes this distinction. Instead, calmness is often interpreted as personality rather than experience. People assume stillness means confidence. They assume silence means intelligence. They assume emotional control means inner stability. But in reality, calmness can be a learned survival response just as much as it can be a developed strength. This creates a hidden complexity in how calm individuals are perceived. Regardless of where their calmness comes from, society reacts to them in similar ways, sometimes with respect, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with discomfort, because people respond to behavior first, not origin, and calm behavior, regardless of its source, still disrupts emotional expectations. But underneath that external perception, there is an important truth. Not every quiet mind is peaceful. Not every calm presence is controlled. Some are simply tired of being misunderstood. Some are protecting what is left of their emotional stability. And some have learned that silence is safer than expression, which leads to a deeper question. If calmness can be both power and pain, then how does society decide which one it is dealing with? The answer is unsettling. Most of the time, it doesn't. Society does not just communicate through words. It communicates through emotional visibility. From early childhood, people are rewarded for expression, smiling when expected, reacting when something is exciting, showing sadness when something is wrong, agreeing when approval is socially required. Over time, this creates an unspoken rule. To be understood, you must also be emotionally readable. This is why modern society rewards expressiveness, emotional transparency, and visible reactions. Because visible emotion feels safe, it allows others to interpret intentions quickly. It makes behavior predictable. It reduces uncertainty in social environments. But calm people disrupt this entire structure. They do not always mirror emotion back immediately. They do not overshare to establish trust. They do not react in ways that make their internal state obvious. And because of that, they become harder to categorize. And what cannot be categorized becomes harder to influence. In group dynamics, this creates subtle but consistent discomfort, not always openly expressed, but psychologically present. People begin to project meaning onto the calm individual to compensate for the missing signals. They are distant. They think they are better than everyone. They are hiding something. They are hard to read, so something must be wrong. In reality, the calm person may simply be observing, thinking, or choosing not to engage emotionally. But human perception does not like ambiguity. It prefers narratives, even incorrect ones, over uncertainty. This leads to a predictable pattern in social environments. Misunderstanding, exclusion, and projection. Sometimes the calm person is left out of conversations not because they are disliked, but because their emotional output does not reinforce group energy. Sometimes they are misread as arrogant because they do not display the expected level of emotional participation. And sometimes they are subtly resisted because they do not contribute to emotional conformity. Because at a deeper level, calm individuals disrupt social control systems built on emotional predictability. Groups function smoothly when reactions are synchronized. When people laugh together, agree together, respond together, and validate each other's emotional signals. This creates cohesion. But cohesion depends on emotional participation. When someone does not participate emotionally in the expected way, it interrupts the rhythm, and interruption creates tension. You cannot influence what you cannot trigger. This is one of the most important psychological principles hidden beneath social interaction. Influence often depends on emotional access. If someone reacts strongly to praise, criticism, guilt, or approval, they become easier to guide emotionally. But when a person remains calm and internally regulated, those triggers lose effectiveness. Calmness exposes emotional dependency in others because it reveals something uncomfortable. How much of social behavior relies on reaction rather than intention? And when that dependency becomes visible, it often creates discomfort in the people who rely on it. This is why calm individuals are sometimes misinterpreted as superior, detached, or emotionally unavailable. Not because they claim superiority, but because their lack of visible emotional participation forces others to confront their own need for validation and reaction. And that confrontation is not always comfortable, which leads to a deeper shift in perception. Calmness stops being seen as neutral and starts being interpreted through hierarchy. Calmness, when it is intentional rather than accidental, becomes something entirely different. It stops being a personality trait and starts functioning as a psychological tool. In negotiation, the person who does not rush to respond often gains more control over the direction of the conversation. Silence creates space, and in that space, pressure shifts. The other person begins to speak more, justify more, reveal more. Not because they plan to, but because humans are uncomfortable with unresolved silence. In leadership, calmness becomes emotional stability under pressure. When chaos rises, people instinctively look for someone who is not emotionally collapsing with the situation. The calm individual sets the emotional tone of the environment. Others begin adjusting themselves around that stability without even realizing it. In conflict, calmness prevents escalation. While reactive behavior fuels intensity, controlled response reduces emotional volatility. The person who stays composed does not feed the cycle of escalation, and therefore often controls the outcome simply by not participating. In emotional chaos, this is where strategic silence becomes important. Not silence as absence, but silence as information control. The less you reveal emotionally and verbally, the more space you leave for observation. And observation is where understanding begins. People often underestimate how much they reveal when they are trying to fill silence or pressure. Tone shifts, contradictions, emotional slips all become visible when you are not focused on reacting. This is also where emotional pacing plays a role. Not every situation requires immediate response. Sometimes delaying reaction changes the entire dynamic. It creates anticipation, uncertainty, and in some cases, subtle psychological pressure on the other side to adjust their approach. At its core, calmness is control over reaction, and control over reaction becomes control over interaction. Throughout history, this principle has appeared in different forms. Strategic restraint in warfare, as described by thinkers like Sun Tzu, emphasized that winning is often about positioning and awareness rather than immediate force. Stoic philosophy, including the teachings of Marcus Aurelius, highlighted the importance of internal stability regardless of external pressure. And political thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli understood that perception, timing, and restraint often carry more influence than open expression. But it is important to understand something carefully here. Strategic calmness is not about suppressing emotion. It is not about pretending to feel nothing. It's about not letting emotion dictate immediate behavior, because the moment emotion controls reaction, external forces gain influence over your decisions. The moment reaction is controlled, that influence weakens. This is why calm individuals often appear to own the pace of a situation. They are not necessarily louder, stronger, or more dominant in a traditional sense. Instead, they control timing. And timing in human interaction often determines outcome more than force power. Is often silent before it is visible. The calmest person usually controls the pace of chaos, but this awareness introduces something deeper, because once you understand how calmness can be used strategically, you also begin to see how it is perceived by others, and not everyone interprets it as control, which leads to an unavoidable consequence. Perception changes everything. Being calm does not always feel like strength. Sometimes it feels like distance, and over time, that distance can start shaping how others see you, even when nothing about your intention has changed. Calm individuals are often misunderstood in ways they never intended. What feels like internal stability from the inside can appear as emotional coldness from the outside. What feels like observation can be interpreted as detachment. What feels like restraint can be mistaken for superiority, and this gap between intention and perception becomes the real cost of calmness. People naturally try to assign meaning to behavior they cannot easily interpret. When someone reacts emotionally, it is simple to understand. Happiness, anger, frustration, excitement, these are readable states. They give social clarity, but calmness removes that clarity, and when clarity disappears, interpretation takes its place. Some will assume arrogance, others will assume emotional distance, some will assume superiority without evidence, not because the calm person is expressing these things, but because the absence of emotional signals forces others to fill in the blanks, using their own internal assumptions. This is where misunderstanding begins to accumulate over time. Calm individuals may find themselves subtly excluded from emotional spaces, not always directly pushed away, but slowly distanced. Conversations may feel less inviting. Social energy may not be directed toward them in the same way. Others may hesitate before opening up, unsure of what reaction they will receive, but the reality is often much simpler. They are not less caring, they are not less present, they are simply less reactive. Stillness can feel like distance to people addicted to chaos. That is the core tension, because many people are unconsciously conditioned to equate emotional visibility with emotional availability. If someone reacts strongly, they are seen as engaged. If someone responds emotionally, they are seen as connected. If someone expresses freely, they are seen as warm. But calmness does not always signal absence of feeling. It signals control over expression, and most people do not distinguish between the two. This misunderstanding can create a quiet form of isolation, not always painful in an obvious way, but subtle. A sense of being slightly outside the emotional rhythm of others. Not fully excluded, but not fully included either. And over time, that can shape identity. Because when people repeatedly misinterpret your calmness, you begin to question how much of yourself is visible at all. You start adjusting behavior, softening presence, or explaining yourself more than necessary just to bridge the gap between perception and intention. But even then, the gap does not fully disappear, because perception is not fully controllable, and this leads to a deeper realization. The cost of being calm is not just misunderstanding from others, it is also the internal awareness that you will not always be correctly interpreted even when you are being completely authentic, which brings everything toward the final reflection. If calmness changes how the world sees you, then what does it begin to change about how you see yourself? In the end, calmness is not something that simply exists within a person. It is something that changes the environment around them. When someone remains consistently calm, they stop acting like a participant in emotional chaos and start functioning like a mirror, not in a deliberate or performative way, but simply by refusing to distort themselves to match the emotional noise of others. And in that stillness, something interesting happens. People begin to see themselves more clearly. Emotional instability becomes more visible when there is no reaction to bounce off of. Attempts at manipulation lose their effectiveness when they are not met with predictable responses. Social performances feel more obvious when there is no emotional reinforcement. Validating them, the calm person does not expose anything directly. They simply do not interfere with what is already there, and that is what makes them psychologically powerful in a subtle, uncomfortable way. Because most people are used to environments where emotional feedback is constant. If they express intensity, they expect intensity back. If they apply pressure, they expect resistance or compliance. If they perform identity, they expect validation. But calmness interrupts that entire loop, and in that interruption, hidden patterns begin to surface. Insecurity becomes easier to notice, control attempts become more visible, dependency on attention becomes clearer. Not because the calm person is trying to reveal anything, but because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, reality becomes harder to avoid. This is where the final shift happens. Calmness is not dominance, and it is not weakness, it is clarity, a form of presence that does not distort what it observes and does not bend easily under what it encounters. That is why calm individuals often feel unsettling to others. Not because they are doing something aggressive or imposing, but because they are not reacting in the expected way. They are not feeding emotional cycles. They are not reinforcing illusions. They are not participating in the usual exchange of validation and reaction. Calmness does not create fear. It reveals it, because what people feel in the presence of a calm individual is often not caused by the calmness itself, but by what the calmness exposes within them. The quietest person in the room often sees everything, and that awareness changes how they move through the world. Not loudly, not forcefully, but observantly, with a level of perception that does not rely on emotional chaos to function. In that sense, calmness becomes less about personality and more about perception, and perception always reshapes reality. So the final question is not about the calm person at all. It is about the observer. What does your discomfort say about you, not them? Because in many cases, calmness is not the source of tension. It is the surface that reveals it. And once that is understood, the illusion breaks quietly, without noise, without reaction, just clarity. The calm person is not scary because they do something, but because they don't react the way you expect.